Hello, welcome back to our Halion 6 video tutorial series, and now we get real. We're going to start having a look at how to import and process samples. So for the first time, we're not going to be creating a synth zone, we're going to be creating a sample zone. First things first, let's drag a program into our slot, create a layer, go to the zones, and now we create a sample zone. And you can see that by default, it's taken us to the zone tab. There's nothing in our sample viewer window. This is where we're going to see our sample, but there's nothing there. And all of this is yellow to tell us that we don't currently have a sample loaded. So let's load one. Open the media bay. You can just see it peeking out down here. Pick up one of these WAVs. Drag it into the sample window. Throw media bay away. And now we have sample. So you can see the speed it's playing. This is a very long sample. If I let go, it just stops playing immediately. So very first things first, let's apply some basic envelope. Let's have a bit more of a release because it's a nice big sweeping pad. So now when I let go of the key, it will fade away gently. And we've already got something that sounds good. Now going back to our zone tab, there are two different ways that you can look at samples, in the zone tab and in the sample tab, and they show you almost exactly the same information. The only thing that the zone tab brings to the party that the sample tab doesn't is this stuff at the top that tells you what key range the sample plays over and what velocity range the sample plays over and what its root key is. So if I press C3, that's the natural sound of the sample. That's where it's being mapped to. So all of this stuff is pertinent to the zone tab. And these few options down here where we're talking about preload and quality. If I make quality anything other than standard, if I make it vintage for instance, then we get the option to reduce the sample rate, reduce the bit rate, make it emulate like an old vinyl record player in terms of the quality of the sample that's being reproduced. Preload tells Halion how much of the sample to load into memory before it even starts. It can load the entire thing and it will hold it permanently. Be careful if you have like very large presets with lots of samples, this is going to stress your machine. For the most part, having said that, we'll just leave that alone. It's pretty advanced stuff. We don't need to worry about it for now. We're just trying to get up and running. And the point I'm making is that everything that I've just described there is the only thing the zone tab brings to the party. From that point onwards, we can basically sack this screen off and jump over here instead. And the sample tab is where we're going to want to do most of our work. All of these options down here on the zone tab are replicated exactly in the sample screen, just not quite visually the same. So this playback mode over here, we can find that on the main page. Playback mode is here. Every single one of these settings here, we've got loop mode continuous, and here's loop mode continuous. We're going to go through all of these settings, but the point is that you can kind of sack the zone screen once you've got your sample loaded and you've set your key ranges and your velocity ranges. Let's concentrate on the sample tab, and now we can do all our work in here. It's a little bit overwhelming, it's a pretty intense screen, there's lots of information there, but if we break it down bit by bit, we'll be fine. So we can see our entire sample up here, but in the viewer we see this ridiculous ziggy line. What's going on? Well, if we click A, then we can see the whole sample. There are a million options on this toolbar up here, and at some point you'll finally need to learn them all. Let's have a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what's going on. If we press this little play button, now it's only playing the entire sample like this at the moment because I've not done anything else. This play button is actually context sensitive. If I jump briefly over to this range selection tool and show you this, and then click and drag an area of the sample, now when I click this play button, if there's a range selected, that's what it'll do. So this play button is context sensitive, you need to bear that in mind. This enables looping. Pretty obvious. Auto scroll and follow sample playback are for when we're zoomed out a bit and we want to track what's going on. It will scroll for us. Follow sample playback is all about what happens when you press a key. So if I press a key, you can see the song locator playing. If I disable that, now press a key, we hear it, but the line isn't updating. I almost always have that on. Just confuses me if I can't see it. Here is our range selection tool that allows us to do that kind of business. And here we can select the magnifying glass to zoom in, pretty obvious. The play tool is useful. That just lets you click anywhere in the screen and start playing the sample from that point. And scrub is similar. I don't use it as much. Basically lets you, I'm dragging the mouse and I've stopped dragging the mouse and now I'm dragging the mouse again. That's what scrub does. Snap I almost always have on. As we see more of the features in the sample editor, Snap will kind of do sensible things. It'll take you to where it thinks you should be if you've got loop points or markers set. Again, for the most part, leave it on. And similarly with snap to zero crossing, if you're selecting ranges inside the sample, then zero crossing is the point where you're at zero on your wave chart, and so you're going to get better looping, better fading between your samples if you set everything to zero crossing. Trim sample, if I click that, I've currently got this zone selected. You can see it's where the sample's fading out. If I trim, that is now the entire sample. And there's the tail. If I decide I don't like that, I can revert. Any operation you perform on this sample is always non-destructive. The sample behind the scenes is completely unedited 100% at the time. Everything we do in this screen is not permanently affecting the audio sample that we're working on. It's only creating a working copy and then editing that. So we can always revert back to our previous version. Normalize. If we go back to the point, just reselect this zone and trim it. Then we've now selected an area of the sample that's not normalized anymore, so we're not going up to 0 dB at the loudest point. And we can verify that with this little option down here that says show gain in wave. If I turn that on, it's now blue. I don't like the way Halion kind of makes it not totally obvious what's going on when you're actually over the control. Kind of move your mouse out of the way to see whether you've turned it on or off. So now that we've enabled this show gain in wave, it lets us click the next button, which is normalize. Now we've made the wave bigger. So now we have normalized it. If I turn that off, then we don't see that normalization. And again, we've normalized the wave, but we've not done anything destructive to the audio sample at all. We've left it alone. So before we get into talking about this sustain release loop button here, let's just talk about the options inside the window a little bit more. So we have these S's, which is set sample start and set sample end. These are these orange S markers. I can drag that wherever I want. And these little green markers inside are sustain loop start and end points. So if I choose something like this, and now play a key on the keyboard, starts at the start, now loops round the loop, and watch what happens when I let go of the key. The loop carries on. Did you see it when it was on its? That's why I made the nice big release in the envelope earlier, so that we can see nice examples of what happens when you let go of a key. It carried on looping round. The next thing that we want to jump across to is the loop tab. So let's go over here. And this is where we see that the loop is currently in continuous mode. If I switch that to until release instead, do the same kind of thing. Now it's going to start looping round, But now when I let go of the key, it breaks out of the loop cycle and carries on playing the sample naturally. So that's how I prefer my until release. What happens when I let go of a key, that's my kind of go-to option. Just feels more organic to let the wave kind of naturally fade out once I let the key go. All of these loop points are set with these. You can see the start value there, and there's the end value. If I link them together and move one, it moves the other synchronously. And we've got a crossfade as well, so let's hear what's that doing. So we don't really want those hard hits. Now, I jumped immediately to 1000 and started jumping in big chunks there when I was trying to deal with the crossfade. What I'm doing here is I'm saying when you loop around, you can see the blue lines that have been drawn. It's crossfading from the end of the loop back round to the beginning again and doing a more natural transition. Bear in mind my current project sample rate is 44.1 kilohertz. So you've got 44,100 slices for every second of sound. So the numbers that we're dealing with here are huge, and it can be a little bit unwieldy dealing with such vast ranges, because we're ordinarily, we like to deal in like 0 to 100. Well, that's just not the case with samples. We're dealing with individual slices of time. So when I say 4,000, that's 4,000 sample slices, which is about 1/10 of a second. So you're dealing in very big numbers. I tend to manually type in my numbers. And that's better, you know, for the purposes of an example. That wasn't bad. This curve is the crossfade curve, so it's the shape that the crossfade will take. You can see it just bending the curve. Tuning introduces a synth-based tuning when you enter the loop mode. So if I set this to 100, as soon as we entered the loop phase, then it's applied that tuning, so you can like detune up or down when you enter the loop mode. From that point onwards, it will remain static. And it held that as well once I released the key. Got all of those options for the release cycle as well, but we can't currently see our release points. So if I select a release loop, now I've got release, start and end points. Let's put them way out of the way over here. So now when we let go of the key, if it's got any envelope left, if there's a release phase on the sound itself, it's going to enter the release loop. And it will cycle around that phase while it's fading out. And we've got all of the same options for crossfading, etc. Now, viewing these loop points, this is my preferred way of operating. I can see all of my markers, I can see what's going on with the wave, but there is a second way that you can edit it. If we click this edit button, we're currently in sustain mode. So now when I click this, it's showing us what's going to happen when we enter the loop phase. And this is basically the loop cycle repeated infinitely. If we go to the release phase instead, we've thrown the loop away, and we've thrown the sustain loop away, and now we can see the release phase, and you can see it's repeated at every period according to the size of the release loop here. If we're in edit mode and we select show resulting loop crossfade, then you see in red the bit of the wave over which the crossfade is being applied. These next 4 options I very rarely have anything to do with. I prefer to work manually and visually with my waves, but you have options here. It has like tolerance levels, where it has points in the wave where it thinks you might want to loop, and you can have it find previous loop start. We'll basically jump through. If I move this start out of the way, it's moving backwards through the wave, finding everywhere where it thinks is a reasonable point to start the loop. And again with the end, this button here, loop transition, big T is for timbre, which is basically like large evolving sounds. If you're doing big loops, then you'll set it into big T mode. If you're doing smaller loops, then it'll be more focused on the sample transitions. And this is where you set that quality threshold that has to be met in order for it to consider this a viable point to set its loop positions to. You can have 2 completely independent loops, A and B. Basically let you set totally different options for all of these values, and they're completely independent. And back over on the main tab, all of that has been in playback mode normal, which basically means it plays it forwards. We can play it backwards. One shot, it throws all the loop stuff away. Once I hit a key, it's going to start from the sample start, it's going to carry on playing until we get to the sample end. There's actually nothing I can do about it. So, regrets. Reverse one shot is the opposite, just inverts the wave. And fixed pitch means it doesn't matter what key on the keyboard you play, plays the natural sample. Start range is a little bit esoteric. In order to show you this, I need to go back over to the modulation matrix and say note on velocity maps to sample start. What this basically means is that depending on how hard we hit the key, we're going to jump to a different place in the wave. And the start range is the number of samples that we'll use to determine what that velocity range is going to span. So if I make it pretty big, if I press a really soft note and now a loud note, it started much further along in the sample, and the range that I set, make it even bigger. Starting about here, whereas soft starts there. If I have start range as 0, doesn't matter how soft or hard I play the key, it's always starting at the sample start. In terms of getting your hands in and actually starting to use samples, we've now got a very rich feature set that even just looking at that thing on screen, I know what that sample's going to do. I know where it's going to start. I know what's going to happen when it's in its loop phase. When I let go, it's going to break out. There are options galore. So inside our looping, for instance, alternate is a really common one actually. I need to deal with this one quite quickly. So set a nice small loop point. Now when it gets into the loop phase, it's going to wash backwards and forwards. Set this tuning back to 0, a bit silly. But alternate looping is a really easy way to get really natural sounding loops, because it's not jumping to another arbitrary point in the wave and starting to play something random. It means we can dial our crossfade back. Let's try 0, see just how good it is. Really not bad. There's little kind of thuds as it goes from forwards to backwards, but not bad at all. Once is pretty obvious. It's literally going to go through the loop once and then escape. You'll notice I've not talked about the slice menu at all. That's an entire subject in its own right, and we'll deal with that in the next video. Hope to see you then, and if you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing, hit notifications, and then you'll find out when my next video comes out. Thanks very much for watching.